It was the perfect scam for its time and would have netted its crew over $4 million in profit, if not for one member being 10 seconds late. Welcome to Sports Scams. I'm Tommy Burns, and this is the story of Harry Solomons and the cutting of the cables. It's every punter's dream, placing a bet on the winner after the event has been run and won. And on December 16th, 1939, in Melbourne, Australia, one man and his crew of punters scattered half across the country. That dream became a reality in the most outrageous way, before eventually turning into a nightmare. And that one man was the local race caller at radio station 3XY by the name of Harry Solomons. Solomons was putting together a reasonable career behind the mic at a time before TV in Australia, which wouldn't be a thing until 1956. Thus, radio was the primary form of media and source of information at the time. From local news to weather to all sporting events, the radio broadcast was how people learned what they knew to be true. Or so they thought. His job as the station's horse racing caller would be to sit in a makeshift radio booth with a few technical staff at whatever track they were racing that day. His racing call would broadcast the day's races and results to listeners all over the country, which included primarily punters and bookies. And they were not alone in calling the races over the radio at the track. Rival stations 3DB, 3LO and 3AW also set up at the track, with their own callers blaring out the races to their own listeners. Despite 3XY being a local Melbourne radio station, many other interstate stations took the 3XY feed to broadcast to their own listeners. And it was because of this that Solomons and his crew could orchestrate a sports scam so outrageous that had he got away with it, he would have become a cult hero and gone into Australian folklore. The day of the scam, the races were being held at Ascot Racecourse in Melbourne's north, which at the time was a privately owned track situated very close to existing racecourses at Moonee Valley and Flemington. Now, Solomons was known around local circles as a bit of a punter, and although his true motivations were never disclosed, the allure of a big payday to settle some old bets or to even set himself up for the future meant he just couldn't resist. He led a group of at least 30 to carefully orchestrate a scam that only he could pull off, and that only his close mates could ensure they all made a tidy profit. Their plan was to literally cut the cables of all the other radio stations situated at the track right before the last race of the day, so the 3XY call would be the only source of truth going out to listeners all over the country. Solomons would then not call the actual race while it was being run and won, and instead waited for it to finish pretending the horses were still behind the barriers. He would then give out a special code to his crew over the airwaves who were listening in other states. This code let the crew know the true winner of the race and allowed them to place massive bets with off-track bookmakers who were none the wiser that the caller they were listening to on the radio was in cahoots with the punters placing the bets. Finally, Solomons would have to call a phantom race, trying to recount what the actual race had been like, ensuring to match up the winners and place getters with the official result. Genius! And seemingly simple to do if everyone just did their job. But of course, one member of the crew slipped up, and it was at this point that their whole scam was going to be exposed. So what went wrong? Well, not much. Most of the steps they had to take were being done perfectly. Step 1. Pick a race with an open field, and thus the winner was more likely to be paying bigger odds. The crew had over £7,000 to bet, so a bigger price winner would return a bigger profit, and the betting amounts wouldn't cause suspicion. Check. They chose a race where the favourite was $4.50, and the other favourites were around $5, $6 and $7. Step 2. Ensure all his crew were betting with off-track bookmakers, who were illegal at the time, it's worth noting, in states where the local radio station was taking the feed of 3XY. Check. The crew was set up across South Australia, New South Wales and in country Victoria, hours away from Ascot Racecourse. Step 3. Ensure that the other employees at 3XY couldn't interfere as they were not in on the scam. Check. Solomons organised for 2 drunk members of the crew to create a distraction and get in a stoush just before the race, and it was right outside his radio calling booth. Naturally, Solomons couldn't leave his post, so both his colleagues had to leave the booth to sort out the skirmish that was happening outside. and the drunks played their part brilliantly, allowing Solomons to be alone for over 5 minutes to execute the scam. Step 4. Cut the cables of all the other radio stations calling at the racetrack just before the jump time. No check. This is where the scam started to come apart for Solomons and his crew. Although they successfully cut the cables of the stations at 3DB and 3LO, the team were a few seconds late in cutting the feed for 3AW. In fact, the horses had run about 100 metres or so, and the caller had already shouted, "They're off," before the feed suddenly went out, and it was those 10 seconds that contributed to the scam being exposed. So how did it all play out in the end? Perfectly at the start, the drunks did their part to clear the broadcast box, and the race was then run and won by a $7 shot named Buoyancy, meaning that the return would be north of £40,000 for the crew, or $4 million in today's coin. Solomons then played his part, staying cool under pressure, watching the real race be run and won, and then begun his phantom call by reading out his code to his betting agents by saying, "Buoyancy is playing up behind the barriers and pulling away constantly." Then, after 90 seconds or so to allow for betting time, he began calling the race from memory, with of course Buoyancy coming home the easy winner, meaning for all unsuspecting bookies, they're about to pay out winning bets in an almighty and outlandish scam. As you would then expect, after the race, things began to quickly unravel for Solomons. The 10 seconds of audio heard before going blank caused an investigation into 3AW's technical equipment, and it was soon found that all 3 radio stations had had their cables cut, except for 3XY, which immediately raised suspicions that foul play was on the cards. Not soon after, his co-worker also said they could hear Solomons calling a race while no horses were running, and many other people around the track who had their radio tuned to 3XY didn't know why he was calling a race that had already been run. Solomons later claimed that he had unfortunately missed the race due to the scuffle outside the box, and decided to then call it again from memory to ensure that the listeners didn't miss the result. But no one bought it, and he was fired a mere 1 hour after the race, after evidence arose from a colleague that Solomons had threatened him earlier that day to make sure he did in fact leave the booth. But afterwards, Solomon didn't seem to be too bothered, stating it was only defrauding off-track bookmakers and they're not legal. But the courts didn't agree, with more evidence from a radio technician who stated that just a few days before the race, Solomons had asked him if he wanted to make some easy money. The magistrate committed Solomons to trial on the charge of cutting radio wires, but not fraud. But once he was allowed out on bail, he made a mad dash and fled to Suva in Fiji on a passport from Auckland, New Zealand, attempting to avoid his day in court. But an Australian detective tracked him down and brought him back to Melbourne, where he faced trial and was sentenced to 6 months in jail in Pentridge Prison. As for the drunks causing the scene outside the radio booth, the actual people who cut the radio cables and all the betting agents around the country, they all got away clean and made a fair chunk of change for their troubles, while poor Harry took the fall for it all. Post the drama across the entire industry, radio engineers were brought in to devise a system which was claimed to make an event such as this impossible to happen again. And what happened to Solomons after he was released from jail? Not too long after, he was arrested again, this time in New Zealand, and charged with stealing $6 from a woman. According to police, he'd been living in Wellington under the new name of Gregory William Kesey. With bail set at $200, we can only assume any future trips to Fiji were not on the cards. This has been Sports Scams. Thanks for watching.